Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 33 of my battle series of videos. This video is covering a hypothetical WARPAC invasion of Western Europe sometime between 1986 and 1989. The map on the left shows the deployment of opposing forces, with a map on the right showing possible WARPAC lines of advance. These maps are very basic and do not show much detail, so let's drill down in order to get more detail. This map shows the approximate position of the various divisions before a possible WARPAC invasion. In order to fit the divisions on the map, some liberty to the exact positions of the divisions has occurred. I'm not showing brigades or regiments, of which there is a number. I'm only showing divisions. Many board games on the topic typically provide three types of scenarios: strategic surprise, tactical surprise, and a build-up scenario. Strategic surprise would only utilise what was on hand in East and West Germany. Tactical surprise would allow for quicker reinforcement schedules, and a slow build-up would provide for an even quicker reinforcement schedule. In all these scenarios, the start positions are similar. I have to admit, I have no idea if I'm personally correct or not, but one of the main Soviet thrusts would have been towards the Reforger sites. If they could arrive before the US transported the men over, it would represent a major victory for the Soviets. However, terrain-wise, this was not an easy path, and Frankfurt was in the way. However, even if the Soviets were not able to stop the US Reforger divisions, if they wanted to cross the Rhine, this was the shortest distance to that river. Moving up north, the Soviets would cut off Denmark so they could secure a path for naval assets into the North Sea. This would have been supported by airborne and naval assaults on Denmark. Down south, the Soviet thrust would be designed to pin the US forces to that position so they could not drive up north to cut off any Soviet advance to the Rhine. Let's now increase the scale to get more detail and look at one of these three main thrusts in more detail. Starting in the north, one objective was, for the Soviets, Hamburg, in order to cut off Denmark from Germany. This would allow the WARPAC forces to drive up north to secure Denmark, which would also suffer significant airborne and naval attacks. Another Soviet column would drive towards Bremen in order to protect the rear of any WARPAC forces driving north into Denmark. This was also a possible entry point for NATO forces coming from the UK or even the US. This shows the same area using Google Maps. The important point to note here is the road network. One point often not understood by lay people is the importance of roads as a path of advance. While the Soviet forces were supposed to have 3 days of supply with them, organic, any serious fighting would quickly exhaust any of these organic supply. So it's critical for them to have a line of supply. You can see a number of roads which lead to Hamburg, which would be the main line of advance for the Soviets. Down south you can see there are only 2 roads towards Bremen. The third line of advance would be towards the Ruhr, which was also a UK Reforger site, which would clearly be a key objective, although it's unlikely the Soviets would have got there before the UK forces or Reforger units had been fully mobilised. This shows the road network of this particular WARPAC line of advance further down south. If the West German 1st Panzergrenadier Division could hold the Soviet Third Army long enough, sufficient NATO reinforcements would have arrived to stabilise this advance at a fairly forward position. Moving a bit further south, possibly the main WARPAC push would be towards Frankfurt, the Rhine, and possibly over the Rhine into the US Reforger staging sites. NATO had a strong force covering the Rhine and Reforger staging areas, so this may well have seen the heaviest fighting of the war. This shows a Google map of the same area. I do find it strange NATO did not have any major forces on the border in this particular critical area. West Germany would have significant border formations, but these would have quickly been brushed away. I suspect when the invasion began, the NATO divisions would advance forward as quickly as possible, moving based on intelligence of the Soviet line advance and force mix. A meeting engagement, I suppose, is a good way of describing this. Other targets in the same area in the south would be Würzburg and Nuremberg. The Würzburg advance would be conducted in order to secure the flank of the main thrust to the Rhine. Würzburg would be a critical point of conflict in the early days during the WARPAC advance and later in the war during any possible NATO counterattack from the south. That pretty much covers what I think would be the most critical fighting during any next war. The next point to investigate is the course of any invasion. I'm using the Victory Games board game NATO, The Next War in Europe, as my guide here. It was published in 1983, and while it does not cover my likely date of invasion in 1986, it can provide a guide. In this board game, there are three options. Strategic surprise, where the Soviets prepare for their invasion in utmost secrecy and NATO is caught totally unaware. The Soviets use a military exercise as a cover for the invasion and achieve a surprise airstrike on the first day of the war. This is the nightmare scenario, which catches NATO totally unprepared and with its air force dramatically degraded. This scenario, to put it mildly, does not give NATO much chance, and I personally feel would be highly unlikely. The next scenario is a tactical surprise. This presumes a period of increased hostility with the Soviets preparing a secret attack, but with NATO going on high alert. When the Soviets strike, they are unable to destroy NATO air power and NATO reinforcements arrive quickly. This is the most likely scenario for any possible next war, as it assumes the Soviets launch their attack in order to possibly quell unrest at home. The final scenario is a build-up scenario where both sides escalate and prepare for war. Some pretext occurs and the war begins. In this scenario, WARPAC has prepared most divisions for war and pre-positioned them. This gives WARPAC the largest possible force mix for any invasion. On the other hand, NATO has also built up and prepared their forces, allowing them to deploy most of their forces to the front line very quickly. This is also a possible scenario and may have been a likely one in, let's say, 1990, as the USSR attempted to unify the country among increasing unrest. The issue was the leader of the USSR was not inclined to go down this path, so it would have only been likely if Gorbachev never became premier and a pro-war military premier was appointed. However, if this occurred, the USSR probably wouldn't have experienced as much unrest in 1990 because glasnost and perestroika would not have occurred. I'm going to go through a possible scenario for a next war situation, and for this particular scenario, I'm assuming we're going to deal with a tactical surprise scenario, which I personally believe is probably the most likely scenario. In this scenario, the Soviets would hit the forward NATO formations and would outnumber them significantly, possibly in the order of 3-1 on day 2. The rear NATO divisions would quickly move up on day 3 as they were on high alert. As long as the initial attacks were held, the line should remain reasonably stable. The real problem for NATO was just behind the 2nd Guards Tank Army there would have been several more divisions from Poland and Soviet forces deployed in Poland. The Soviets would have sent the 2 divisions in Poland and a Polish army to assist them in this front, which would have forced NATO forces back. The British would have landed an additional division and the West Germans mobilised several homeland defence brigades, but NATO would still be very much outnumbered. Not shown here are the 15 airborne regiments and 2 marine regiments, Soviet, which would have landed all over Denmark. I really don't know what the result of this would have been, but I feel that Denmark would have almost certainly fallen, but the Soviets would have been held back in Germany. I suspect this general scenario, which was created by WARPAC, specifically the Polish, would have probably occurred. WARPAC would have been able to advance deep into West Germany, but would have failed to get to the Rhine and would have been held. The real wild card is nuclear and chemical weapons. Once the Soviets were bogged down, the urge to use chemical weapons would have been too great, and NATO would have had little choice but to respond with tactical nuclear weapons. This would have ended in a horrific nuclear stalemate, but I suspect would not have gone strategic, but would have been rather ugly nonetheless, particularly for the poor Germans. Let's look at a board game to see what the designers of those games thought the next war would be like. BAOR was published in 1981, so this represents a period earlier, once again, than my 1986, but we can at least look at the formations, which would be roughly the same. This shows the battles which would occur in the north for the wide outflanking Soviet thrust, which would have been conducted by the Soviet 3rd Army and 20th Guards Army, in the initial wave at least, and with the 5th Guards Tank Army and 7th Tank Army following up in the second wave. The red line shows the intended Soviet line of advance as they were driving towards Belgium. The blue line at the top represents the line of defence in front of Hanover, a critical objective the Soviets would need to take. At the bottom represents another blue line of defence in front of Kassel, another critical objective the Soviets would need to take. The dotted line represents NATO covering forces, which consist of about 5 West German brigades. The solid line shows the main line of defence, consisting of 2 West German divisions and a British division. The red arrows show the entry hexes for the Soviet forces. Finally, the blue lines on the left show the entry areas for NATO forces, a combination of British and Belgian divisions and other formations. This lists the baseline force mix for each side. There are a number of sub-option scenarios which varies the force mix on each side depending on the type of Soviet attack, but this is probably the most likely one, assuming that this was a major thrust by the Soviets. The Central Front series of board games have 2 more games, Fifth Corps, shown here, which covers the Soviet drive to Frankfurt. The last game in the series is Hof Cup, which covers the Soviet drive to Nuremberg. All 3 maps can join together to create a monster game, totally unplayable and impossible to place on any normal-sized table, but if you can find a large enough table to set it up, it can look rather impressive. I set this up once, but after I did that I lacked any energy to actually play a game. Based on my subjective opinion, I suspect any WARPAC invasion would have bogged down in Germany. The numeric superiority of the WARPAC forces indicated that they could easily roll across Western Europe, but I suspect factors such as training, troop morale, troop quality and doctrine would have thrown a serious spanner in the gears of any Soviet invasion. And so this concludes episode 33 of my military history video series covering a hypothetical WARPAC invasion of Western Europe in the late 1980s, sometime from or between 1986 to 1989. I certainly hope you enjoyed this rather hypothetical video. Luckily, it never occurred, especially for all my relatives in Germany. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.